Alright guys, can we have your attention up here? This is David Rust from Lyft, formerly a few other startups he'll tell you about. David went to Stanford as undergraduate there. He's got an open invitation to go to Harvard and do an MBA there, so he's playing his options right now and deciding what he wants to do in his future. I know David from New York actually when I used to do banking. David was one of the interns I hired for a summer, so he flew out there from Stanford for after your freshman year, and basically for free helped me with the solar cell project and other projects he's working on during my banking time. So he's obviously come a long way since then. That was like 4 years ago or 5 years ago, something like that. And he's here to talk to you guys today about his career and about Lyft.
Well, it was awesome to get to chat with a bunch of you just before this. And it's so cool to walk around because I majored in civil and environmental engineering at Stanford, and a lot of my friends did mechanical engineering, and I would always have a lot of fun just going through the labs, and this is basically exactly what the labs look like at Stanford, just a ton of gadgets, cool stuff happening, really exciting stories being made. And so I thought that the most helpful thing that I could start out by talking about was kind of relating to, I guess, where I was when I was your guys' age and kind of how that evolved and really how like my interests evolved, because I think if you look at a lot of people's careers, I think very few people know exactly where they're headed and exactly where they'll end up, and that journey is one of the most kind of interesting things. And right now I'm at Lyft, as Robin mentioned, so I can kind of also discuss how I ended up there. But before I got started, I wanted to just see, first of all, if there are like certain topics or things about Lyft or certain career things that you guys wanted me to touch on specifically, so I can like make sure to include that. So if there was anything that you guys specifically had questions about.
Maybe just talk about your journey to where you are now, career-wise.
That's cool. Anything else? Awesome. Well, so I started out as an engineer. I wouldn't call myself an engineer now, but I studied at first material science and engineering at Stanford. And so for 2 years, it was really focused on tiny atomic scale projects. And so when I was working with Robin, the project that I was doing at school at the time was focused on atomic force microscopy, which is basically looking at certain materials like on the atomic scale, like solar cells and others, and really figuring out how materials on that scale can impact like the behavior of how a solar cell is powered. And personally, I kept finding myself being really interested in really where technology meets a business need. And that's why it was funny, I think back to when I started working with Robin, I found this job posting that was in New York for a summer, and I said, this sounds interesting, shot out or applied to it, and all of a sudden Robin contacted me back. And I remember you like called me, and I think we did our interview while I was like walking around downtown Palo Alto on a cell phone. Next thing I know, this was actually the summer after my sophomore year, I was in New York, living there, and it was fascinating because what we were doing at the time was basically finding professors, mostly professors basically from universities who were doing really interesting research, and finding applications for that to become companies, or not even companies, it could be licensing that technology to someone else. And it was so fascinating because you basically got to bridge that gap between people who had a deep knowledge of certain technical skills with certain applications, and a lot of times that link hadn't been made. And so we talked to people from anything about paints that had properties that could keep a building from getting dirty on the exterior because they're very resistant to water, for example. Or we talked to something more straightforward with various solar cell technologies. And seeing that intersection and how companies are built led me basically to, right when I got back to Stanford, I started working at their basically technology licensing center. So they call it the Office of Technology Licensing. And the way it works at Stanford is that if you're a professor, whatever research you do, Stanford technically, and this is true at any university, technically owns the rights to that information and the patents that come from that. And so the Office of Technology Licensing works with these folks to basically turn it into companies. So Google actually came out of the Office of Technology Licensing from Stanford, and that was through basically Sergey and others basically had a technology. They tried finding companies who would want to buy it, and they worked with the Office of Technology Licensing. They pitched this idea to all these different people, and everybody said, that sounds like a shitty technology. Nobody really needs it. And so then they worked together to basically create the company, file the patents, and to this day, the majority of the money that Stanford's made from technology licensing is from Google, which makes a lot of sense. And so there's a whole world out there of how to take technology and apply it to various business needs. And I think one common thread that goes through it is that I think a lot of these people started with like a very specific challenge that they were focused on. I was talking to Justin before, who was showing me like, a self-balancing kind of Segway-esque device, or you were talking to me about a solar panel kind of rotation device, and a lot of these people were focusing on a specific need. They said, for example, we really need, for example, with the paint technology that we were talking to, I think there was a very specific application where they noticed that certain types of buildings in the United States, and especially kind of commercial buildings, really had a need for this, and that the cost of basically not having a clean environment was very high. And so a lot of times it starts with this very small application and goes from there. And I was kind of comparing that when I was walking over here to where Lyft is at right now. And the journey of that company and how kind of the technology aspect meets the business requirements is a very kind of nuanced one, and I think very unique in that, number one, why do we have pink mustaches on cars? And number two, the company had actually been around for 5 years before Lyft was ever started. And that's also kind of an odd thing. So I'll jump into kind of the story of Lyft and then kind of bring that back to kind of how I ended up there. But when Lyft started, it was actually called Zimride. Have any of you heard of Zimride? Very, very few, because it didn't do very well. But it basically was a way that, for example, students on university campuses who were traveling to the same destination could carpool together. So, for example, Stanford students or Berkeley students who are driving to LA for the weekend could post and say, hey, I'm driving there, book a seat in my car, you can charge whatever price you want. Somebody can go with you. It increases the occupancy of cars. And it actually was at a pretty decent number of universities, and a variety of companies used it as well to decrease the number of people who are driving in and parking at their campuses. And at some point, the company was around for about 5 years, running as Zimride, under 20 employees. So it was very small, and it was located over on Brandon Street. And you can actually still see there's a billboard that says Lyft with like these balloons going up. It's on 5th and Brandon. If you check it out, that's the old office. And at some point during a hackathon, so every month or so at Lyft, we do a hackathon where anybody can come up with an idea, they can pitch an idea, a team comes together, and in 24 hours they try making something happen. Lyft actually was built during one of those 24-hour periods where people said, you know what, I think people really want a more real-time way of getting around. Like, I don't want to have to post and say I'm going to LA in a week, and then manually coordinate where to pick up each person. There was just a lot of friction in that process. And so the founders and the engineers got together and they said, all right, how do we make this happen more quickly, and how could you get a ride literally within a few minutes? And so they built Lyft with that in mind and released it to a small group of people. And so at that time, I wasn't actually at Lyft. This was 2 years ago. But one of my best friends was there, and I always hung out at their headquarters, and so I was one of the first kind of beta users of the product. And what they saw from the get-go is that at a very small scale, I mean, they released the app initially to like 20 passengers, and there was maybe 10 drivers on the road. So very, very, very small. But everybody who used it basically did not stop using it. It was, like I used it maybe 5 times a day. And a lot of times, I think at companies you have that moment where you say, you know what, we literally only have like 30 total users, but those 30 total users literally cannot stop opening the app and cannot stop using it. And then you think, all right, there's probably something there. That trend continued, and they continued to open it up to more and more people and develop the app to the point where they literally sold Zimride to Enterprise Rental Car, and every single employee shifted over to Lyft, and it grew from 20 employees to where it's now 300 in a year and a half. And so there's that crazy kind of moment when things switch, where you had a company that was around for 5 years that had less than 20 employees, and then in a year and a half, it goes to 300 employees, and you raise basically 99% of your funds during that time. Just to give you an example, at Zimride they had raised a few $1 million. At Lyft we've raised now basically nearing $300 million. And so you can't even compare the scales. But it all started from just a really passionate user base that couldn't stop using it. And I think that the last thing I wanted to mention about how Lyft kind of got to where it is now is that when you think of Lyft and you compare it to competitors like Uber, and people ask what the main difference is, one word you'll hear a lot is community. That you might hear that Lyft has, it's all about the drivers, it's all about you sit in the front seat, you can fist bump your driver, there's a pink mustache, it's a much more kind of fun social experience. And that was very purposeful that was created. I think initially, the people using Lyft, sitting up front was basically one of the key tenets. So John Zimmer, one of the founders of Lyft, was very adamant about a few things when Lyft started. And so a pink mustache on the front of the car, sitting up front next to your driver, and fist bumping your driver were like these 3 core tenets that you might have, like early on they probably sounded really stupid. It's like, why, of all the things that you could do, why would that be very important? But it was interesting in that the act of sitting up front in the driver's seat was something actually radically different. If you get in a taxi, they have this really bulky meter that makes it so there's actually like very little room to even sit up front, and the seat's usually pushed all the way forward, and very rarely do you have a conversation. And so that act of saying, no, you should actually sit up front, there's plenty of space for you, there's a person here to have an interesting conversation, was what people became addicted to, and that's what we noticed. And so from very early on, we had a community team whose sole job was basically to focus on cultivating that community, and that community has led to our growth. So much so now that we have drivers and passengers that are so passionate about Lyft that when we launch new cities now, we actually just send drivers to that new city to launch it for us. So we flew drivers to Hawaii recently to launch Honolulu. Drivers from Chicago drove to Madison, Wisconsin to launch that city. It's happening everywhere, and so it's a really cool instance where a small, passionate community of people, showed that we should focus on community actually as a core tenet of the company, and it's evolved with us so much so now that the way that we grow as a company is from the community, and that like literally how cities are launched, how drivers are onboarded. Each time a driver joins, they meet with another driver from the community to get on board with Lyft, and so it runs throughout every aspect of the company. And so I think when I look at kind of bring it back to my trajectory and my career growth and kind of why I ended up at Lyft, as I mentioned, when I was working with Robin, the part that I enjoyed the most was talking to these professors and these researchers and tying it up with a business need. So it's really the human story behind technology and figuring out why do people need this, and that kind of evolved. And so I right after college I started working at a company called Reputation.com. Which basically provides a product that lets you monitor and manage the information online about yourselves. And again, it was a very interesting tie of technology, this time totally digital, with a human story. Who are these people that really care? Doctors really have a vested need in making sure that the information about themselves online is true and accurate. When people are looking up, which doctor to pick, for example. And I went from there to Wheels, which was a car sharing company, similar to like Get Around. Do any of you know Get Around or Relay Rides? It's basically you can rent a car from another person. And I was there, and that's when I really started to get really interested in what Lyft was doing. And at some point I basically jumped and said I need to join this company, and that was when Lyft was just in San Francisco, and I joined the launch team. So I basically lived in every single city that Lyft was opening up. Basically, I was homeless, living in Airbnb. So I would just rent houses, for example, in LA and Seattle and Chicago, and there would basically be like 2 or 3 of us in a city, meeting all the drivers, getting the marketing stuff started, and getting the city off the ground. So that's kind of the trajectory of where I went, and a bit of kind of how Lyft has grown. So before I kind of keep going, I wanted to see whether anybody had questions about any of that. Cool.
Already have a question?
So you talked about community.
Yeah.
Was that a thing from the start, or was it only after you had the 30 users in the beginning?
Yeah, so she asked basically, was community something that we focused on at Lyft from literally the start, or was it after we saw some initial success? So there's kind of both parts in it. Number one, there were basically almost product features that were meant to build community in there from the beginning. So from the beginning, it was very clear that when somebody gets in the car, the driver should say, by the way, feel free to sit up front. So that's like building community through the product. Or, they give each passenger a fist bump, or just the fact that there's a big mustache in the front of the car, which is something to kind of, laugh about and share, a fun story about. So that was very much so in there. Now, that would actually take on and turn into a much larger community, they really didn't know. And so I think it was much more of a put something out there and see how it sticks, and community really stuck. And so from that point, very early on, there were people hired whose job was to manage community and whose goal was really to build that out. So, yeah, any other questions? So,
Can I ask a question?
yeah, go for it.
So I read yesterday my hometown news. So in Pittsburgh, that Lyft is illegal there and Uber's illegal. But what's up with all the lawsuits? Like, why is it so illegal?
Yeah.
Like, why would someone not want a wonderful service that is so much better than taxis?
Yeah. So the question was, there's a lot of lawsuits happening right now with Lyft and Uber, and basically why is that happening? So, when you look at what Lyft is basically enabling, is it's something that's outside of really any current kind of laws that are in place in most cities. So first of all, to start, the laws governing transportation and taxis and that sort of thing are city specific. In some cases, there's laws on the state scale that also govern it, but there's not like any national, federal laws that govern it. And so, in each city, this concept of somebody driving their own car, and they could just drive it for 1 hour to pick some people up, was never really in place. So if you think about how a taxi cab company works, they're actually more like rental car companies. So if you drive a taxi, you rent the car from Yellow Cab, for example, for a certain amount per day, and then you keep everything that you make. So when you drive that day, you need to make sure you drive enough to make the money back that you just rented the car for, and then you need to drive to make profit on top of that. And so again, these people are much more professional drivers, and these cars are professional cars that are dedicated exclusively to use for commercial purposes. The way that Lyft works is totally different, right? You could be a student, you could studying here, working here during the day, and then you decide after work, hey, for 1 hour I'm just going to hop in my car. I have a 2012 Honda Civic. I flip into driver mode and I go drive a couple people around, and then I go home. It doesn't really make sense to impose the same regulations on that person as like a professional full-time driver who's driving a taxi cab. And so the short way of saying is basically there aren't regulations in place that specifically understand how it works. And so a lot of times what happens is just a need for education. And so in California, for example, Lyft is widely used here, and it's like the first state that Lyft was in, but Lyft was close to getting shut down here as well. And it was only after basically the Public Utilities Commission did a thorough kind of analysis of how Lyft works, and they looked into how our background check processes work, and they looked at how drivers are onboarded, and they looked at all the safety measures, and they basically said, our interest is public safety. We want to make sure that people are using a service that is not endangering them. They looked into it and they said, you know what, Lyft is actually much safer. For one, after a ride, you can rate the driver. That's something that you cannot do on other platforms, so there's no feedback loop to improve the system. With Lyft, there is. The background checks are much stricter and much more stringent than anybody else out there. There's a lot of these checks and balances, and so they said, you know what, this makes a lot of sense. It's actually creating jobs locally as well, and so they passed legislation to basically enable it in California. That's basically happening on a state-by-state level. The reason it gets harder and harder is now that Lyft has grown and people know about us in other cities before we even go there, there's more opportunities for a kind of entrenched interest to get a head start on basically combating us before we get in there, right? So there's a lot of lobbies out there that have interest in not enabling Lyft to be in a city, and they can kind of get a head start talking with local regulators. So a lot of what we do is we go in and we just educate folks and say, these are the benefits of Lyft for your city. It can reduce congestion on the road. It actually can add a lot of income into the local economy. There's a lot of other benefits that go along with it. So, yeah.
When you go into a new city, how do you
Yeah. So the question was, how do we recruit drivers in new cities? It was very hard early on. As you can imagine, I remember flying 3 days after I joined Lyft. I was on the launch team, so I flew down to LA, and Lyft had just opened there, and it was all a question of how do we get people to drive. And so now it's easier. Now there's a combination of Facebook ads, a variety of places digitally that people can basically find out about becoming a driver. And also now that we have a lot of drivers, they refer their friends. So there's a cash bonus that you can get if you're a driver, or even if you're a passenger and you refer someone to become a driver and they become a driver. So now that we're at scale, it's easier. But early on, it was really manual. So we would have some people apply to be drivers. We would call them up and really reassure them that we're a real company, right? Because imagine you apply to be a driver, you see an ad with like a car with a pink mustache on it, and you're like, what is this? They're promising me, a certain rate per hour. I can't envision what this could possibly be. So we basically combated that with just a lot of in-person touch points. We would call them, they would come into the office, we'd meet them in person. We had welcome sessions where we basically invite groups of like 20 drivers in at a time to the office and do like a training session. So we basically just did all of this stuff to engender trust and show legitimacy as a company. And it took a lot of manual effort early on, but it was worth it because once you seed a market with that trust and it gets to a certain scale, then trust becomes easier, right? Once you've seen Lyft, once you've used Lyft, you're not going to question it if you want to become a driver. And a lot of times passengers do become drivers because that easily works if you have a car. So it's a great question. Any other questions?
So you talked about the committee for the community. Are they going to focus on the drivers and the people who use Lyft, or are they more focusing on Lyft as a company?
The community team? So focus primarily on drivers right now. And so really the philosophy is that if we can really spend our time building community with drivers, then drivers will share that sense of community with their passengers in the car, right? Because ultimately the experience is all predicated on like you get in a car and it's that 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever it is that you have sitting next to that driver. And so that's why we invest a lot of time and effort into doing many things for drivers that really build a sense of community, give people opportunities to meet each other face to face through events. We have private Facebook groups where drivers can chat. They're incredibly active. They can share stories, they can share photos. We have a totally dedicated blog where we have a bunch of content about the things that are going on across the country, led by drivers and amazing stories. And stories are the primary driver, I think, of how people really understand what we mean by community, right? So, I think back to a story of here in San Francisco, a driver picks up a couple that actually turns out to be going to City Hall to get married. They didn't have a photographer, they were just like, winging it, let's go get married right now. Turns out the driver was a photographer. He flipped out of driver mode at the end and he said, you know what, for free, I'm gonna just photograph your wedding for you right now because this is like such a special day for you that you really don't want to forget. And so, it's things like that where he took, hours out of his day to really go up there and take these incredible photos that we then actually, the passenger emailed it in because the passenger was so blown away that, him and his wife basically said, this driver is like forever part of the day that we got married. And those stories actually happen, maybe not that exact one, but they happen every